Welcome to another Listen Up, our audio series for dentists. Today we're privileged to have one of the most respected and I think one of the most acute people who work on theft and fraud in the dental office. Let me introduce you to Mr. David Harris. Having been in this game for 30 years, it always amazed me how many dentists have had the experience of money being taken or stolen and fraud occurring in their office. And usually the person who does it and how it's done and how to be aware of it and all of that, I always found that if I could somehow have dentists have some way of assessing what's going on, if I could improve that whole way and decrease the amount of theft and fraud in the dental office, it would be a great contribution. And I think this audio today with David will do that. He's really a brilliant guy and he's been doing this for about 20 years, so he really knows what he's doing. So, David, the number one is thank you for being on the call, and number two is would you spend a couple moments introducing yourself to our audience?
Sure. My name is David Harris. I'm a private investigator and sometimes called the dental fraud guru. And for the last 20 years, I've been chasing down frauds in dental offices and putting people who steal from dentists in jail.
Well, that sums it up quickly, David. Let's talk about how you go about doing that. How would a dentist discover that something's going on? What do people usually run into? I mean, you for 20 years, you've run into almost all the scenarios. So what is the most common thing that dentists, and how do they find out?
The sad thing, Mark, is that most of them find out by accident. Dentists go to a lot of trouble to put a control system in place that people tell them will do a lot of things for them, including prevent fraud. And that control system is incredibly ineffective at finding fraud. If I work for you and I'm going to steal from you, I understand fully the system of controls that you have in place because I'm the person who operates them. So if you're somebody who checks your day-end sheet every day, I know that if I work for you. And if I'm going to steal from you, I'm going to do it in a way that doesn't leave a mess on your day sheet for you to look at if that's something you do. If you insist on making the bank deposit yourself, then again, I'm well aware of that. And I'm going to design a fraud that will not leave an obvious discrepancy in the bank account. In other words, a discrepancy between what should be deposited and what you actually deposit. So this vaunted control system, and there's a whole consulting industry out there that sells this to dentists, and I don't dispute those at all, but in terms of detecting fraud, it's close to useless.
Wow, so what should a dentist do, or how does the suspicion first arise?
What I tell dentists to do, and please understand, Mark, I'm not saying that these controls are a bad idea. All I'm saying is that their linkage to fraud prevention isn't nearly as strong as some people would tell you. For example, checking the day-end sheet, I think, is a fantastic idea for every dentist because it will catch clerical errors. It will catch a 4-surface filling that got written down as a 2-surface and cost you money. And the time investment in checking the day-end sheet is well worth that. What it won't do is stop fraud. I honestly don't know how many ways there are to steal from a dental office. I always tell people for planning purposes there are 1,000, but that's not because I've counted them. But there are a lot of ways to steal from a dental office. The good news is that no matter which of these ways your thief is using, the way that they'll behave is very consistent. They will become territorial. They will not want to take vacation. They are the person who kind of lunges for the phone when it rings because if it's a patient with a question about an account, they want to be the one to answer it and to give a reassuring answer that will make the patient think no more of it and certainly not think that fraud is going on. So there's a series of behaviors that these people exhibit. Another one is that they like to give you financial reporting late because the later they give it to you, the less likely it is that you will correlate what the report shows with what was really going on. So if you are somebody who checks day sheets and you count on the front desk person to deliver them to you and they do it 2 days late every time, by that time you've probably forgotten pretty much what happened 2 days ago, and that's what they're counting on.
So there's the suspicious behavior that you're observing, and then usually dentists are so busy. The interesting thing from my viewpoint, David, it's usually the person that you trust the most.
It is always the person you trust the most.
Okay. My experience is that the episodes don't begin unless there's some causative factor to incite that person to begin? It usually starts on a small amount and gets larger and larger over time. In your experience, is that accurate, or does it usually start from the very beginning? Or
you just said three things that are very profound, and let me put them together. Most of the fraud we see, and I'm talking here about big fraud, not somebody taking toilet paper home with them or something like that. I'm talking about serious financial fraud. Almost all the financial fraud we see has been perpetrated by somebody who's been there for a very long time, is exactly what you said, the most trusted employee. And when we look forensically back at their life, something has happened to them that sort of pushed them over the edge from being an honest employee to being a thief. In other words, when they were hired, we're pretty sure in most cases these people had no concept whatsoever that someday they would steal from their employer. But something's happened to them, and it could be a divorce, it could be their spouse dying, it could be somebody in the family with a medical issue that isn't covered by health insurance. Something happens that puts their back to the wall.
And usually, in my experience, David, is they don't go to the dentist and talk to them about it. They hold it within themselves and try to work it out, and then, they take that one little piece in the front end, didn't get caught, and it just opens up that door even wider.
Absolutely. A lot of times I think this starts by accident. Somebody makes a mistake, and it results in too much money coming in from an insurance company somewhere.
Right, and then they see the opportunity from that?
I think that's what happens. As I say, it starts as a kind of accidental theft, and then it progresses from there to something deliberate, and it starts relatively small, but within a fairly short period of time gets big. But most of these people have unvarnished employment histories. They have no criminal records. There was no inkling when they were hired that they might do this someday, and I think there was no inkling in their own mind. There is such a thing as a serial embezzler in dentistry. I mean, we've seen a few cases of somebody who sort of jumps from practice to practice and steals each time, but they're really rare. The vast majority of the thieves are long-term employees, and exactly what you said, they're the most trusted. I mean, a comment we get very frequently is, that's the person who hostess for me when I go on vacation.
Exactly. So you see this suspicious behavior, you begin to suspect. We should start talking about how you enter into the picture and what you do in terms of your process.
Absolutely. I'm going to start by almost answering your question, because what I'm going to talk about is what dentists shouldn't do. And there's one overarching priority, and that priority is, if you have concerns, not to tip the suspect off to the fact that you have those concerns. If I am stealing from you and I sense that you are about to catch me, my strong self-preservational urge is to destroy evidence. The problem with that is that evidence is your medical records. There was one case, we weren't involved, but somebody phoned us, talked to us about fraud, decided not to hire us, and did their own kind of do-it-yourself fraud investigation. And the mental picture I have of a dentist doing their own investigation is like 30 bulls in a very small china shop. And of course, he tipped off the thief to his concerns unwittingly, so she burned down the office.
Well, that will handle it.
It wasn't what I'd look at as a successful outcome. So the strongest priority for the dentist is not to tip off the thief, and that's an easy thing to say and a very difficult thing to ask. I mean, we're asking somebody who now is wondering if somebody's hand is in their pocket to act normally, to not start asking extra questions or requesting a bunch of extra reports from staff or spending a lot of time in their private office with their door closed on the phone to their CPA. We really need the dentist to deliver an Oscar-worthy acting performance here, and it's tough.
They first contact you, and that's the first advice you give them is don't do anything to throw suspicion in the game?
Yeah, and don't do the things that are intuitive to do. You know, one of the things people do sometimes is they phone their dental software company, and the response from the technical support people at some of the software companies often is, well, you know, the software you're using is 2 versions behind the current one. Let's update you to the current version. There's some intuitive sense to that. The problem is that the reason that the software is not updated is because the person on the front desk doesn't want it updated, because they have some plan that's working now, and their concern is that, you know, if I upgrade my Dentrix to G5, that whatever game I'm playing right now won't work anymore. So if you want to arouse their suspicions, the first way to do it is to go into them and sort of insist that the software be upgraded. But that's advice that dentists get given very commonly. Another thing that's instinctive but not a good idea is to phone the police. The police in most jurisdictions have absolutely no expertise to investigate this kind of fraud. But when a citizen phones them and makes a complaint, the first thing they will do is they will send either two big guys in uniform or somebody who looks very much like a police detective to the office to take the dentist's statement. And either of these things will very quickly tip off the thief as to what's going on. There's a time to phone police, but it's later in the process.
Well, let's talk about the process, David. So they have a suspicion. They call you. What do you do?
Well, we do a couple of things. The first thing that we do is we do a behavioral assessment of the suspect with the dentist. So this doesn't take very long. I mean, it's a 15-minute exercise, but we look for behaviors that are indicative of fraud. And that's really just to try to screen out some false positives here, because sometimes we get calls from people who have concerns, but their staff really aren't doing anything at all that should give rise to a legitimate concern. And we try to discourage those people from spending a lot of money on investigation.
And how do you do that behavioral assessment? Do you go in the office? Do you ask the dentist to observe? Do you have a question?
None of the above. We will talk to the dentist and simply ask her or him about what they're seeing in terms of the employees.
Okay.
And internally, we have an assessment questionnaire. Sending one of my people to the office, Mark, would be as bad as sending the police. This is done over the phone. It takes a few minutes. And what we're really trying to do is to gauge the temperature of the situation.
Okay, and so the suspicions have arisen. You suspect fraud or theft, and then what happens next?
Well, the next thing we do is we tell the dentist the things not to do. Again, this really comes back to the performance of duties as if nothing's going on. It's very hard. I mean, when you, as a business owner, are convinced that somebody in your business is stealing from you, I mean, you want them out the door today. And a lot of times we're telling these people, no, we need to keep them there a little bit longer because we don't quite have enough evidence yet to get rid of them. And if you do, you've got potentially employment law kind of issues. We need another 3 or 4 days to complete our investigation. But the way that we investigate most fraud is that we make arrangements to gain remote access to the dentist's computer software, and then we analyze it using our own stuff, and we look for patterns that are consistent with fraud.
When you say your own stuff, the dentist wants to know, and you don't need to give away proprietary secrets here, David, but it'd be nice to really understand some of the stuff that you do when you start to drill down into and what you're looking for.
Absolutely. There are a number of transactional patterns that are consistent with fraud. For example, most fraudsters want to do their work at a time when they can be alone in the office and not have anybody sort of looking over their shoulder and say, oh, what are you doing? So they tend to come in after hours, either in the evening or early in the morning when nobody's likely to come by the office, and that's when they do their work. So one of the very basic things that we do is that we identify transactions that happen outside of a sort of normal window around business hours, and we look at those more closely.
So you have these particular markers that reveal that something's going on of this nature?
Exactly. So we typically import stuff from their dental software into our own analysis tools, and then we start screening out high-risk transactions and patterns.
Okay, so let's say you find something, then can you get the depth of it, or can you get the how broad it's been, or can you get the length of time it's been going on? Or
Absolutely, we can. Most times we break our investigation into 2 phases, and we think of a primary phase, and the purpose of the primary phase is typically to answer a very binary question. Is there theft going on or not? And assuming that we find theft, that's the point at which the employee gets terminated. Now our investigation becomes overt. In other words, we're not as concerned anymore with people knowing that we're doing it because the perpetrator is gone. So in most cases, when a dentist phones with a concern, we do a relatively quick investigation first to find out if it's happening. And if it is, then we start mapping it so that we can look at avenues of recovery, how much money we can get back for the dentist.
David, spend a little bit of time there, because usually what happens, and I know that the range can vary from a couple thousand to way beyond that, and then we'll talk about criminal charges later, but how do you look at how to recover money? Usually these folks are pretty desperate with their, with their money. How does that work?
You're absolutely right. We get very little of this back from perpetrators. You identified the reason exactly. They're stealing because they tend to be in a position where they're not even sure their basic family needs could be met.
Right.
There are several potential sources of recovery. I mean, the first place is that most dentists have some kind of employee dishonesty insurance coverage, so that can be accessed. Now, that's usually relatively modest amounts. I mean, we typically see coverage of somewhere between $25,000 and $100,000. The last year that we looked at, the average fraud in our case files was about $150,000. So the insurance is unlikely to be a full source of recovery for most of the fraud we work on.
Okay, so you get what you can from the insurance company. You look and see if they have any assets or equity in their own possession.
And sometimes they do. I mean, one of our clients just got a check the other day for about $47,000 from somebody who was stealing and decided to cash in her 401k and hand the money over to the dentist in exchange for some leniency. So that was kind of a welcome development. Again, we don't count on it, but it happens sometimes. The other source is that in a lot of cases, one of the ways that people steal is they take checks that come into the office payable to the dentist and they deposit them in their own bank account. And it still astounds me that banks let this happen, but they do. On the other hand, when we find it, we have a bank to go after, and in most cases they will make good.
How is it the bank's accountability to, because they see this influx of money and that they aren't suspicious?
State laws on banking vary a whole lot. The legal validity of a dentist case on this would vary widely from state to state. But yes, the banks are accepting fraudulently endorsed checks. They have some duty not to do that. It's really calling them on that duty. However, the real factor is this, and we're just dealing with a bank on this right now, and we're in a state where our legal case isn't very strong. But I said to the bank the other day, if your depositors had any idea how stupid you are with their money, they take it somewhere else. And that gets the bank's attention. In other words, forget our legal case. We have a practical case here, because at the end of the day, a bank can only exist if its depositors think that it can. And that's called into question. And this is a little 3-branch bank somewhere. And if the dentist starts going around town telling people that they should be concerned by putting their money in that bank, pretty soon the bank's going to have a problem.
Do you report to the government at all when you see a bank in this fraud, commingling this fraudulent activity?
I haven't yet, and I'm not sure I ever will. It's really the threat of that reporting that's effective. Once you actually report, you've sort of lost your leverage.
All right, so now you have your analysis done, you have it complete, the person's been dismissed. What are the next steps that you guys take?
Well, that really depends on what the client wants us to do. One of the biggest questions I get asked early on by most dentists is about criminal prosecution. And probably the thing that not everybody understands about this is that criminal prosecution is really the responsibility of the government, not the citizen. So the dentist's participation in the whole prosecution process is really for him or her to decide how much of the information that they've gathered or that we've gathered on their behalf they want to share with the government. And it can be very little or a lot. If somebody's making a claim on their employee fidelity insurance, normally the requirement is that there be a police report. If I want to make claim, I have to report to the police, but I have a choice. I can either report a little bit of information, which is really to phone the police department and say, look, there was somebody who defrauded me, I'm making an insurance claim and I need a file number, but I don't really want anything else done with it, in which case they'll normally give me a file number without really opening a file. Or I can say, I was defrauded by so-and-so, I expect the full weight of the law to fall down on her, and I've directed the investigators I hired to fully cooperate with you, in which case they will get a copy of our full report, which should more or less tie up in a bow the information they need in order to prosecute.
David, what do you find out is the percentage of people that actually bring the full weight of the law down, or the dentists who just write off the loss and say education's expensive? What's your usual finding in terms of their behavior?
I think about 40% of the people we talk to end up prosecuting. The only thing I'll point out about that is that's about double the number who initially think they're going to prosecute. I distinctly remember one situation. This involved a dental specialist, and when he first found out about the fraud, his response was, well, I don't want to read about myself in the paper. I don't want the general dentist to refer to me to see what's going on. You know, he was concerned about his reputation, and I understand that. And as our investigation unfolded, and he saw the calculating way in which this woman had stolen from him, his perspective changed. And the straw that broke the camel's back for this particular specialist was when he saw that the thief, who among other things was in charge of payroll, had been paying herself at 150% of normal time, in other words, overtime rates, for the extra time that she spent in the office stealing from him. When he found that out, I almost had to pry him off the ceiling.
You know, the anger that arises because you work so hard for your money and someone that you absolutely trusted has broken that trust. The relationship has been going on for anywhere from 5 to 10 years. The innocent, and you bring, they come in the office, you've been talking, and you've been worrying about your cash flow. I mean, it all erupts all at once. It's clearly understandable.
I understood his reaction too, and I normally tell dentists at the outside, that's not a decision that initially. I mean, that's not a decision you have to make now.
In terms of recovery, what do you usually recover of the fraud? What percentage would you say?
That varies so widely. I mean, I'm hesitant to even give a number.
Okay.
We almost inevitably get something, whether it's 20% or 40% or 100%. Really depends on the situation. I mean, there was the case we dealt with relatively recently where somebody stole a lot of money, and their father was a rather prominent citizen, and he wrote a check for the full amount because his position in the community was important to him, and he didn't want to be reading about his daughter in the papers.
So if you were speaking to a group of dentists and that you absolutely, of course, would have their attention, they always say that prevention is a lot cheaper than trying to solve it on the end. What would you recommend to a dentist that's got 5 staff and is working their little tails off? What can they do?
Unfortunately, I have to tell people that on the one hand, I think prevention is impossible for a couple of reasons. One is that there are so many ways to do this in a dental office, and I've got 6 investigators, and about every week one of them is shaking their head saying, "You're not going to believe this one," and it's some new wrinkle that we found. Thieves are ingenious people, and they're desperate. And the combination of those 2 factors lets them continue to come up with what are, at least to my firm, new and innovative ways to steal. Again, there's this industry of dental consultants out there, who believe that deterrence will work, and that if we just put enough controls in place, and if they're the right ones, it will stop people from stealing. Controls will stop crimes of opportunity. If I leave my bicycle unlocked somewhere, somebody may steal it. That's a crime of opportunity. If I leave my keys in my car, if I leave my house unlocked, this isn't that kind of crime. It's a premeditated crime, and it's done by somebody who sits there and stays awake at night and sort of moves the pieces around in their head and thinks about how to do it and then implements it. When they do that, they know a heck of a lot about you. They've worked for you for 8 or 10 or 20 years. They know your habits. They know how you think. They know what you look at, and more importantly, what you don't. And they're going to build a fraud that will escape your scrutiny. And if you change or increase your pattern of scrutiny, then that is just what I described in an article once as a speed bump on the fraud highway. We're just wrapping up an investigation right now, and what happened was somebody had a fraud pattern, and their pattern was that they were stealing money and then showing the balances the balances that were left when they stole as being uncollectible and writing them off. So at some point, the dentist, who didn't really suspect fraud, got a little bit concerned about the amount of write-off that was happening in her practice. So she took a very standard response. She said, "Okay, I'm now going to implement a control, and any future write-offs that happen, I'm going to have to personally authorize." We have the benefit of looking back at this later so we can see exactly what happened. And what happened was that 3 days later, the thief started stealing with a new modality, which tells me, Mark, that when she was stealing by pocketing write-offs, even at that point, she was considering the possibility that at some point that particular gravy train would end and she would need to have a new approach. So the dentist brought in her control, and within less than a week, the thief is back in business with a new methodology.
Wow.
That's what leads me to point to the futility of spending money and staff time on controls that at the end of the day won't stop fraud. What I always emphasize is early detection, and the way that I tell people to detect is to watch staff behavior. We have a checklist, and I'm happy to share it with anyone in your group who wants to email me and ask for it. Now I can give the email at the end of the interview if you like. We have a behavioral checklist. It's about 25 questions. It would take a dentist all of 2 or 3 minutes probably to complete. It's a variant of the one that we use internally. And I would encourage every dentist who hears this to take that 5 minutes every 3 months or so and just ask themselves the questions about their staff.
Okay. Well, let's go complete, because you did a brilliant job. You know, I've been in this game for a long time, and, you know, when you came across my purview, it was like very refreshing to find someone who's had, you know, 2 decades of experience, who really understands the dentist mentality, someone who really understands how the game is being rigged from time to time, and it just does a wonderful service. So, David, how do people get in touch with you? How do people contact you?
Well, there are a couple of ways to reach us. First of all, our toll-free number is 888-398-2327. I'll give that again just in case, 888-398-2327. Probably a better way to reach us is email, and we have a couple of choices there. There's something that we refer to as our fraud hotline, and the email address for that is fraud@Prosperident, which is Prosperident, sort of short for prosperityfordentists.com. So fraud@prosperident.com. That email is monitored every day of the year by our duty investigator. So if somebody sends an email on a Saturday night, sometime Sunday they'll get a response on that email. I also don't mind if your dentists have concerns and they want to talk to me, to email me personally, and my email address is david@prosperident.com. So in any of those ways they can reach us, I'm always happy to have a brief conversation with a dentist who has concerns and sort of see what it looks like is happening, and then if we go to investigation from there, we can explain to them about costs and timelines and all those things.
Well, David, I'm glad you're around, buddy. You know, in my experience, and I know this is an exaggeration to some degree, but at least 20% of my clients over their career get embezzled.
The number that we see is that the lifetime probability of a dentist being a victim is about 50, somewhere between 50 and 60%.
Yeah, well, you're much more acutely aware of it than I have been, but I'm just thrilled that we have people out there that can do the job that you do and do it as well as you do. So, David, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for what you do. It makes a difference to the dental profession and certainly makes a difference to my clients.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark. Yeah, I really appreciate you spreading the word. You know, more people need to get the message that this is a problem, but there are solutions.
And you are the solution, so thanks, David. I'll talk to you later.
All right, Mark.
Thanks. Bye-bye.